Well, Barbara, thank you for the lovely introduction. It's incomplete, however. I actually was born in the United States. If you read in my biography that I was born in Mexico, I have certificates to prove this. But a much more salient detail of my biography for today's purposes, I'm often introduced as a speaker. I think it would have been more appropriate and more truthful to be introduced as a donor to JNF. About 12 years ago, when I was editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post, I had the opportunity with my mother and father to dedicate a piece of the Eshtal forest in memory of my mother's nonna, Ksenia Baskind. And after my father died, I had the honor of my life to dedicate a forest in his memory. I know JNF is more than just about trees, but I like trees. And we should have more of them. Some of you have heard me speak before. I was just speaking at a JNF event the other night in Cincinnati. And I had 9 extremely cute rules for the next president to follow, assuming the next president is going to take my advice, which is impossible. She probably, well, she's likelier than the other one. You know, this election, it's funny, there's a wonderful line, a great Jewish philosopher once said, mankind stands at a fundamental crossroads in its history. Down one path lies hopelessness and total despair. Down the other, complete extinction. May we have the wisdom to choose wisely. So, I swore to the JNF organizers I would keep my remarks nonpartisan, so that is the only remark I will make about this election. I am going to talk a little bit about how the next president, whoever she or he may be, how that person ought to conduct a Middle Eastern policy, because they will have to conduct, whether they like it or not, a serious Middle Eastern policy. And I had these rules in mind, which some of you have heard me give before, but the more I thought about it in the last couple of days, the more I realized that all rules, all the commandments, if I can be a little bit of a sage at the moment, they all boil down to one thing, one essential point, which was made a few years ago by my Wall Street Journal columnist colleague, Holman Jenkins. Holman had a wonderful line. He said, there are certain ideas and certain arguments that vanish in the presence of thought. And what I would like to suggest, what I would like to offer for those of you in this room who can perhaps bend the ear of our next president, is to maybe scribble some of these points down, because there are, when it comes to U.S. policy in the Middle East, so many ideas that vanish in the presence of thought, and I thought it would be worth taking some time to put them down on a list and mention what they are. I think the first point I would like to make, and it should seem obvious just 5 days after a certain 15th anniversary in this city, is the idea that has some currency, especially among foreign policy intellectuals, that terror is not an existential threat. You've heard this said before by high public officials, various other people, making the claim that, for example, more people drown in bathtubs than die in terrorist attacks. Now, this is a somewhat astonishing claim. Last time I checked, in the year's 2011, I assumed that there hasn't been a massive increase in people drowning in bathtubs. 93 people in the United States drowned in bathtubs. Now, in a year, if you were to extrapolate that and assume that most of the world, or at least large parts of the world, also have bathtubs in which to drown, you would come to a figure of about 16,000 people worldwide. Last year, 28,000 people were killed in terrorist attacks. And we used to be able to comfort ourselves somewhat, if it was any comfort, in saying, well, most of these people are being killed in God-forsaken places like the Northwest Frontier Province in Pakistan, or Yemen, or northern Iraq, or eastern Syria. But today, the mass murders are happening in San Bernardino, in Orlando, in Paris, in Nice, and they will happen again. And the problem with the argument that terrorism is not an existential threat is that it confuses the question of will and capability. Right now, Great Britain has the capability to be an existential threat to the United States. Great Britain has 4 Trident missile submarines with about 196 nuclear warheads on them. They could ruin our day very, very quickly. But while Britain or the French have the capability, well, maybe the French, they do not have the will. We worry somewhat about countries like Russia and Chinese that, of course, unquestionably have the capability and might, under certain circumstances, have the will. Now, what's terrifying to consider today is that with the massive increase of terrorist groups in, if not possession, increasingly close proximity to weapons of mass destruction, you will have groups that unquestionably have the will and might perhaps soon gain the capability to exercise that will. North Korea just conducted its 6th nuclear test, its 2nd nuclear test only this year. That suggests they have large quantities of fissile material in order to conduct these tests. We know they have a plutonium route to a bomb. What we're going to find out in the next few days is whether the latest test was done using uranium. And if they've used uranium, that will be interesting because the uranium program that North Korea also has is likely one that it has shared extensively with the Islamic Republic of Iran. How comfortable are we and how confident are we that North Korea and Iran, which we know share nuclear technologies and ballistic missile designs and platforms, how confident are we that that test that was just conducted in North Korea was not, in fact, an Iranian nuclear test, meaning the world's leading sponsor of terrorism might just have tested a nuclear weapon. I don't say that as a certainty. I just put this in your mind as something that might be considered. It might be considered in relation to this question that terrorism and terror is not an existential threat to us. Now, the second thought I would want the next president to give some thought to is this extraordinary notion that terrorism has nothing to do with religion. Not at all. No connection whatsoever. That groups like Islamic State in Iraq and al-Shams have no connection at all to any kind of religion of any description. That in fact, it behooves senior members of government to delete the word Islamic State when the fellow in Orlando is calling in and swearing his allegiance to the Voldemort of terrorist organizations, that is to say, the one that must not be named. Now, this is dangerous for a number of reasons. First of all, it doesn't help us when we try to obliterate words. It doesn't help us to clarify our thinking. That kind of Orwellianism only clouds our thinking, and if we're going to win a war on terror, or whatever it is that you want to call it, we have to call things by their proper name. When Dwight Eisenhower was trying to bring together the world to fight Soviet communism, he didn't say, I don't want to call it communism because that would give too much credit for these bullies and dictators and Russian nationalists in the Kremlin. He called them by what they are. When Franklin Roosevelt declared war on the Empire of Japan on the 8th of December of 1941, he did not avoid using the term Japan or the Japanese. We did not call Hitler or refuse to call Hitler a National Socialist because there are people in America who are socialists whose feelings might have been hurt by the description. And the main point to make here is that when you fail to notice the obvious and intrinsic connection between a religion and the acts that are carried out in its name, you are failing to fight a crucial part of the battle. That is to say that just as the war against the Soviet Union wasn't just a kinetic war or a war of tanks facing off with one another across Checkpoint Charlie in Berlin, the war was also an ideological war. We had to muster the reserves of intellectual courage and clarity to make the argument in defense of liberal democracy against communist dictatorship. Today, we have to muster exactly that same kind of intellectual muscle to make the case for liberal democratic values against enemies who see themselves, even if we don't, who see themselves as virtuous, who see themselves as possessing a divine right if they could have the opportunity to slaughter every single person in this room. So it does not do to simply say, well, these guys are just a bunch of killers, and we're not going to dignify them with the name of a great religion. We have to start working with people inside of the religion to say, there is a huge problem that we have here, and we're not going to win this war unless we win the argument against these people. That's why people like Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, the president of Egypt, when he last year gave a speech denouncing what had become of Islam in the last 100 years, thanks to the Muslim Brotherhoods, thanks to Sayyid Qutb, thanks to the Salafists. That's why we should be giving him aid and comfort, not turning our eyes and averting our gaze. Now, a third lesson for the next president. We are going to have a Middle Eastern policy. It has been the conceit of the last several years that somehow the United States, being the world's only superpower, can simply turn our attention elsewhere. We can pivot to Asia. We can focus on nation building at home. We can ring fence, as the British like to say. I love that. Every so often the Brits come up with a word that actually makes any sense. We can ring fence the Middle East and say, well, that's one corner of the world, and we're going to avoid it like the plague. My grandmother, I'd mentioned earlier, I grew up in Mexico. My grandparents came to Mexico in the 1930s. My grandmother was a friend of Leon Trotsky before he met an unfortunate demise. Leon Trotsky liked to say, you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. Well, we may not want to be interested in the Middle East, but the Middle East is interested in us. Its refugees are interested in coming to our shores. Its terrorists are interested in infiltrating our borders. Its fanaticisms, its furies, its ideology is interested at converting vulnerable and susceptible young Muslims or converts here in the West. Its agonies in Syria or Libya or elsewhere are interested in exploding onto our shores. So no president can have the luxury of saying, as a certain presidential candidate just did, that we're never going to go back in there. We're never going to have ground troops again in the Middle East, because that candidate might be setting up herself, I'm sorry to say, for a lie. We are going to be going back in. And the next president is going to have a serious will to exercise American influence in the Middle East, not to make our dreams come true, not to bring democracy to the Palestinian Authority or to Iraq or to Afghanistan, but centrally to keep our nightmares at bay. What I would say to the next president, is draw up a list of the 4 or 5 things you will not allow to happen on your watch and come up with a plan for making sure they don't happen. If along the way, miraculously, a peace deal is struck between Yemen and Saudi Arabia, or between the factions in Syria, or unbelievably, incredibly, maybe between Israelis and Palestinians, terrific. But that ought not to be the central focus of your strategic vision. That shouldn't be where the weight of US policy is involved. This is what American policy has to be. Make sure that Iran does not come within an inch of having a nuclear weapon. Make sure we destroy ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra on a schedule somewhat faster than the one in which either the Sagrada Familia Cathedral or the Second Avenue subway is being built. Make sure that Russian influence doesn't continue to expand and that you have a growing condominium between Russia, an unholy alliance between Russia, Damascus, and Iran. Make sure that other friendly regimes in the country don't crumble, because that too is a risk. So that would be a way of thinking about a serious American foreign policy in the Middle East. Now, this next point I would offer the president is, don't try to conduct Middle Eastern policy, especially Middle Eastern policy, as a kind of moral vanity. I mentioned Abdel Fattah al-Sisi a few minutes ago. This guy is not someone you would want necessarily as your mayor. Maybe. Depends where you live. But where you live, you wouldn't want him as your mayor. This is not a guy who is going to win any awards from the American Civil Liberties Union for standing up for absolute freedom of speech. He runs a repressive regime, often an incompetent regime, sometimes a nasty regime. And he is a man who is standing, as it were, on the lip of a bubbling volcano. He is the guy who right now stands between the potential collapse and chaos of Egypt, the largest Arab country in Israel's country with which Israel shares its second longest border. He is the man who's holding the line. Support him, not because you like him, but because the alternative is so much worse. Look at Saudi Arabia. None of us, I'm sure, particularly admire the Saudi system. None of us want to put our wives in hijabs and then refuse not, well, 99% of the time, not let them drive. In my mother's case, it would be fantastic. None of us want to have a medieval form of law. But the alternative in Saudi Arabia is not some kind of reformed Bernie Sanders progressive vision of Vermont. The alternative in Saudi Arabia is either an even more repressive but anti-American regime, which is a possibility, or its collapse into something that resembles Syria today. Don't forget, I would say to the next president, that Saudi Arabia has some of the same sectarian and ethnic rivalries that Syria does. Much of the population of Saudi Arabia is Shiite and restive, and that population happens to live in some of the most oil-rich areas. Do you really want to see this regime, or risk seeing this regime, either becoming an anti-American regime, making friends with the Russians or the Chinese, or crumbling into dust? Would that solve any American problem or advance any American interest? So that's an idea that also vanishes in the presence of thought. Let's distance ourselves gratuitously from long-standing allies in Riyadh and Cairo because we don't necessarily love and admire their human rights practices. Now, a few more points I'd like to make in connection to terror. You'll often hear it said that the problem that we have in the Middle East is a failure of governance. You see, terrorism is the result of poverty and despair. This would be an astonishing piece of news to the family of Mohammed Atta, the ringleader of 9/11, an upper-class Egyptian family. It would be astonishing news to the family of Ayman al-Zawahiri, currently the leader of al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden's number 2 man, well-educated doctor, grew up in a wealthy Cairo suburb. It would be astonishing, of course, to Osama bin Laden himself, were he still alive. One of the richest men in Saudi Arabia, heir to one of the largest fortunes. The suggestion that somehow terrorism is the result of poverty or bad governance or the lack of democracy simply fails the test of experience. Where did the killers from Paris last November, where did they come from? Did they come from Somalia? Did they come from some other ungoverned corner of Africa? No, they came from Brussels. The only misgovernance taking place in Brussels has to do with chocolate laws and EU regulations. This is not a problem of a failure of governance. It's not a problem of an absence of democracy. This is a problem of ideology and conviction. And you're not going to be able to win a serious war on terror, much less, or even fight a serious war on terror, if you're not able to see that this is not a war that's going to be won by huge infusions of foreign aid into misbegotten places. And it's not a war that's going to be won either by trying to advance the cause of democracy in places where it has so much difficulty taking hold, or when it does take hold, invariably advances illiberal movements and illiberal regimes like the Erdogan regime in Turkey or the Hamas movement in Gaza. Let's be serious about the kind of problem that we are facing when we look at terrorism. Now, another problem that the next president is going to face is the problem of Iran. Of course, some of you in this room may be under the impression that we have in fact solved the Iran problem. Or maybe not. It's a strange thing that no sooner was the deal with the Iranians signed that they began testing ballistic missiles on a regular basis, that they began re-imprisoning American Iranians who had been advocating the deal, thinking that they would get a piece of the new Iranian economy once there was a new understanding with the West. It's a strange thing for our Navy men who were taken hostage or prisoner off of Fars Island in the Persian Gulf. It's a strange thing for naval commanders who every single day are being swarmed by Iranian fast attack boats. It's a strange thing for our friends in Syria who see that Iran's efforts to prop up the Assad regime, to drop chlorine bombs on innocent civilians, have not abated since this Iran deal took hold. It's a strange thing if you just simply listen to what the Ayatollah Khamenei has to say. His rhetoric about the United States, his rhetoric about the West, his rhetoric about the deal itself hasn't softened. He hasn't eased up on the anti-Americanism. It's America, the semi-great Satan now. On the contrary, it's hardened on every front. We had a belief, a hope, maybe the right word is a conceit, that in signing this deal, we would be empowering Iranian moderates. In fact, the biggest tragedy about this agreement is that it has turbocharged the hardliners, the most hardline elements within the regime, with $150 billion of sanctions relief, amazingly a large amount of that money in cash, access to Russian weapons, and an opportunity to start once again importing dual-use items from the West. Just 2 months ago, German domestic intelligence services released a report that says, and this is not the CIA speaking, this is the Germans, so it must be right, that says that in fact Iranian efforts to acquire dual-use materials with applications in nuclear, for nuclear installations have more than doubled in the last year since the agreement was signed. We just learned that we're giving exemptions to Iran that were previously unknown that allows them to keep more uranium than was agreed to in the deal, that allows them to keep more of the so-called plutonium hot boxes that were agreed to in the deal, that allows them to export more heavy water than was agreed to in the deal. That is the reality that the next president is going to be facing with the Islamic Republic of Iran. Not an Iran that feels like it's turning a new face towards the West, but an Iran that believes it is winning on every front and can press its advantage against an America and a West that is weak and in retreat. And that is what the next president will face. So what I would say to the next president is, you have an agreement, you should attempt to honor the agreement. You should enforce it unsparingly. And if the result is the agreement falls apart, so be it. Now, another point that I would like to offer the next president is the suggestion that the fundamental problem that America has had in the Middle East is a problem related to our policies. That's the idea that over 60, 70 years, America has had pursued terrible policies in the Middle East, which have alienated the people of the region and therefore created this giant swamp of hatred, conspiracy theories, enmity, out of which the ISISes and the Jabhat al-Nusras and the Paris killers and so on have emerged. If you listen or read certain major New York City papers that are not the Wall Street Journal, you may believe this idea. I will be selling subscriptions, by the way, to another major metropolitan New York City paper afterwards, so come see me in the hallway. This is the idea that if only we hadn't, say, supported the Shah of Iran, if only we hadn't supported the Mubarak regime in Egypt, or the Ben Ali regime in Tunisia, or the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, if only we hadn't invaded Iraq or invaded Afghanistan, if only we didn't support Israel, we wouldn't have quite such a problem. And the truth is that 8 years ago, this administration came to office with something like that idea. What was the problem? The problem was the policy. How do you solve the problem? Change the policy. How can you do that? Get out of Iraq. Get out of Afghanistan. Don't get yourself involved in Syria. When there's an uprising in Iran, a popular uprising over a contested election, go out of your way not to meddle, intervene, be seen as meddling or intervening. When there's a popular uprising in the streets of Egypt, dump the guy that you've supported for the last 30 years in the space of a day. Say that he must go now. Go to Cairo, give a magnificent speech, call for a new dawn in relations between the United States and the Muslim world. Put some distance between yourself and Israel. Make sure that it is seen that you have an adversarial relationship with the guy who happens to be the Prime Minister of Israel. Do these things. Now, you can make an argument for all of that. Okay, I wouldn't make that argument, but you can make an argument. But you can't make an argument that the result of all of those policies, the consistent theme of which was change the policy, has been an abatement, a lessening of the hatred and enmity that's so widespread in the Middle East for the United States, for Israel, for the Jewish people, for the very idea of Western civilization. That is, yet again, another idea that vanishes in the presence of thought, as Holman says. The reality is very different. The reality is that while we've had better policies, worse policies in the Middle East, there may be people we shouldn't have supported, people we ought to have, the reality is that the conflict between the Arab world, or much of the Middle East, and the United States, and much of the West, is not about policy, it's about values. It's about the fact that we believe that there should be a wall between religion and state, that we believe that men and women were created equal and should have the same opportunities and chances in life as men. We believe it. We believe in the dignity of religious and ideological differences, and that we are enriched by having those differences. We believe in the concept, in the principle of mockery, in the idea that not only do we have a right to speak freely, but we have a responsibility in this country and in the West to know how to take offense in a measured and sensible way. We believe that if you can mock Mormons in a hit Broadway musical and they laugh at it, or don't laugh, or just shrug their shoulders, then maybe we should be able to mock anyone. And it might be in bad taste, but it's not against the law, and it's not against our principles. Those are the things that we believe in. So we are foolish to imagine that we can win over our adversaries in the coin of policy concessions. What they want aren't policy concessions, they want value concessions. And no American leader, whether it's a Republican, Libertarian, Democrat, or progressive, or whatever, should ever concede 1 millimeter of our values to the totalitarian values of our opponents and enemies in the Middle East. Now I want to get to a few more, just a handful of other points, ideas that vanish in the presence of thought, and they have to do with Israel. You know, for about, 45 years, maybe it was 60 years, the consistent message out of our friends at the State Department, out of the foreign policy establishment of the United States, serious, deep thinkers on these issues, was that if only you could solve the Israeli-Palestinian or solve the Israeli-Arab conflict, all the other conflicts would simply kind of melt away. In fact, when you used to say the term Middle East peace process, you knew that it didn't mean Yemen and Egypt, right? It didn't mean Iran and Iraq. It didn't mean Turkey and the Kurds. It meant only one thing. The only peace process worth talking about in the Middle East was the Arab-Israeli or the Palestinian-Israeli peace process. It was the only thing worth talking about. And you'd have serious guys, smart people. David Petraeus even said this. Not all of his decisions were wise. That is the keystone conflict. Just take care of that and everything else gets solved. I think the last 5 years have erased this idea fairly forcefully. And no serious person can now imagine that solving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it is important, desirable, hopeful, is going to do a single thing to keep the people of Aleppo from being starved and maimed and bombed to death. It's not going to do a single thing to ease the human rights crisis in Iran. It's not going to do a single thing to keep the Taliban at a distance in Afghanistan. And it's certainly not going to do a single thing to keep the next terror jihadist attack from occurring on the streets of a French city or an American one. So that is another idea that we should finally put to rest. But let me mention two others that are, I think, more salient. One is the settlements. If only the settlements went away, we'd have peace. It's a fantastic idea. Simple ideas are fantastic ideas, and the word fantastic doesn't just mean good. When I was editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post in 2004, I made the argument in favor of disengagement. I don't think Carolyn Glick has forgiven me in the 12 years since. But I made the argument for disengagement, and one of my points was, well, if Israel is finally behind these lines, the 1949 lines, after all, or the June 4, 67 lines, then no country, no French diplomat could ever say Israel won't have a legitimate right to defend itself in the event that it's attacked by a future state in Gaza. Well, you can see how well that argument worked out. I also made the point that maybe a Gaza statelet would be a test run, a beta case for what a Palestinian state might look like. Well, it turned out that I was right, but not quite in the way that I had hoped for. We see every single day in Gaza what it means to have Palestinian self-governance in the absence of every single Israeli settlement, every single Israeli settler, and by the way, a sovereign Palestinian border with another Arab state, the Egyptian state. The idea that Israel is blockading Gaza is yet another of those lies. I wish that Israel's conflict with the Palestinians were a territorial conflict. If it were a territorial conflict, what's the problem? Redraw the border. We don't have a territorial conflict because there's a 49th parallel that divides us from Canada. Imagine if tomorrow someone said, actually, the US-Canadian border was drawn mistakenly. It's actually a mile to the south, and the United States is going to lose thousands of square miles of sovereign territory from Minnesota all the way to the state of Washington. How many people would say, "Bo"? It would make no impression because we have no existential issue with our neighbor to the north. It's a purely territorial problem. The truth about Israel's conflict with the Palestinians is that it's not about 1967, it's not about territory, it's not about so-called occupation. It's about 1948. It's about existence. And the only question that matters is whether Jews are going to be allowed to occupy any kind of territory in that land if the Palestinians were to have their way. And sadly, so far, the answer has been a consistent no. So I wish the next president, instead of constantly demanding that Israelis take risks for peace for the sake of another concession towards the Palestinians, turn that question around and start saying to Mahmoud Abbas, why don't you take risks for peace? Two more points I'd like to mention. One is a point that you now hear, you heard many years ago from guys like Pat Buchanan, you hear it from all sorts of other quarters. Israel is a liability for the United States. Our support for Israel costs us, it's going to cost us $38 billion over the next 10 years. It costs us in terms of our diplomatic position in the world. It costs us in terms of the quality of our relationship with the Arabs. It costs us in terms of global public perception because the weight of global opinion is so lopsidedly on the side of the Palestinians. Another idea that vanishes in the presence of thought. You know, in my adult lifetime, the United States has sent its young men to fight and die for the defense and freedom and security of people in Kuwait and Somalia and Bosnia and Kosovo and Iraq and Afghanistan, even as far out as the Philippines. American soldiers have all died in those places in just recent years. Since 1945, America has garrisoned rich countries like Germany and Japan, now South Korea, Spain, in order to protect their freedom. I think that's a fine thing. I have no objection to that. But it's worth remembering that the only country, the only ally, where there's not a single or barely a single American soldier putting his life in at any kind of risk for the sake of that ally is Israel. Israel is our only ally that actually defends itself. When people say, how can we be giving the Israelis $38 billion over 10 years, $3.8 billion a year? First of all, you might mention that all of it is going to be spent in the United States. But you might also mention that the United States spends $8 billion a year to protect Germany and a similar amount to protect the Japanese. It is extraordinary to have an ally that not only defends itself, but teaches us, through the example of its defense, how we should be defending ourselves. And that is a miracle, and that is an alliance worth treasuring. A final point. The next president of the United States might have an advisor who has a son, I won't mention who will make the argument that Israel does not belong in the Middle East, and it's an artificial state. Not just an apartheid state, an artificial state. This is an argument you hear very often if you read various magazines, newspapers on the far right, far left, or in Le Monde in Paris. That's worth rebutting. It's worth saying that that may be the biggest lie that the next president needs to forcefully dispel, not only for public consumption, but in his or her own mind too. All of you must visit Israel. If you're here, I'm guessing you visit Israel pretty frequently. And so you probably have the same experience that I do, which is that 2 days earlier, you're reading, God forbid, the New York Times or some other newspaper, and my wife is a music critic for the New York Times, so hopefully you're reading excellent music criticism in the New York Times. But at any rate, whatever you're reading, or you're reading Haaretz online or the Jerusalem Post online, you're going to feel terribly depressed about the state of the country. You're going to be thinking about Iran. You're going to be thinking about Hezbollah with 100,000 rockets. You're going to be a little worried about Palestinians and this stabbing intifada of theirs. All these thoughts are going to be on your mind. You're going to get on the plane. You're going to schlep over there. You're going to get off the plane. And instantaneously, you're going to feel better about the country. It's unbelievable. You just get off. You sort of start feeling better about the place. And if you're like me, you're probably going to go rent a car, and the young woman behind the car rental agency is going to be very attractive, but also somewhat annoying. And you get in your car and you go. And maybe you drive, you're staying in Tel Aviv, and you start driving up the Ayalon freeway. And you look around this city that didn't exist when some of your fathers were born, or mothers were born, 1909, 1908, when it began. And it's this incredible, thriving, modern, gorgeous, sexy metropolis with these huge skyscrapers, these wonderful amenities, and just beautiful people. An astonishingly happy, vibrant city. And you look around and you say, everything that is here was made here, was placed here, was built here, was designed, was thought through right here. This city belongs in the Middle East more than perhaps any other city. Just compare it to a place like Dubai, constructed by Bangladeshi workers on South Korean engineering templates. Or maybe you're going to drive the other way, and you're going to drive up towards Jerusalem. And not long after you get on the highway, you're going to see the forest on your right. You're going to think of my dad and my great-grandmother, Yishtaol. Keep going up into the hills. You get to Jerusalem, you see that beautiful Calatrava bridge. And then maybe you're going to, I don't know, go see the city of David. Next morning, you're going to get up early, and you're going to go down, 100 feet underground, and you're going to see these enormous stones that were placed there by your ancestors, the Jews, 2,500, 2,700 years ago. And suddenly it's going to dawn on you, maybe way down there, that while so much of the Middle East, in its fury and fanaticism and dysfunction, is in the process of being blown away, violently blown away, the only people and the only country that is genuinely deeply rooted in that land and in that place is the state of Israel, are the Jewish people. The next American president should take that tour. The next American president should understand how profoundly real and how profoundly enduring the state of Israel is and always will be, thanks to those of you in this room, thanks to JNF, to which, again, I am proud to say I'm not only a speaker, but a donor. On one condition. Oh, yeah. Okay, thank you. All right, I think I'm taking questions, if anyone would like to.
And there are
Okay. All right, sir.
Hi. Thanks for that wonderful talk. I've been thinking.
I'm not trying to block you out. You have a spotlight right behind you. So.
I shine.
Yeah.
I've been thinking since you started your talk with self-introduction as a donor to JNF, and I'm new to JNF. I'm trying to learn all I can about it, and with your worldview, with the knowledge you have, with the understanding of Israel and the Middle East, and your deep concern, this may be a silly kind of question, but I'd like to hear the answer. Why is it that you decide to be a donor to JNF?
Well, the first reason was that my mother was. So that's, I guess. Well, it is the true answer. And then when my father died, I could think of nothing I wanted to do more. But it's only then, after donating the forest in my dad's memory, that I began to start to learn about the scope of what JNF does, which you hear endlessly from Russell. It's not just about trees. The other night I was in Cincinnati, where the main effort was to raise funds for a community in the Negev that is a community that is for children with very severe mental disabilities. I have a, second cousin in Israel who has one such child with very, very severe disabilities. And the truth is that when you think about Israel, and look, the first time I ever went to Israel was 1983. I was a kid, and we drove down. My mother had been on a kibbutz Bet Alpha in the 60s. And we drove down to Beersheba, and my mother kept saying, "Now you're going to see the desert." And we kept not seeing the desert. It made this immense impression on me that this was in part also about the land and the cultivation of the land, and that part of Israel's legitimacy has to do with the fact that it uniquely has literally enriched the soil and the land, that this land of Israel is not some kind of nebulous concept and the Jewish people could, in 100 years, simply go online and have a virtual state of Israel. But that question of land and the uses to which you put it and the connection and the way in which you connect people and land is, to me, a deeply stirring, a deeply moving one. So whenever I go to Israel, I don't know about you, you kind of look around and you say, it looks better. And it's not just nicer apartments or whatever. It's not just some kind of concept that the country is doing well in cyber warfare, sales to China or whatever. But the country is literally being improved. When I was in Israel in 2002, there was a tremendous drought, and the Kinneret was very, very low. And I remember in 2003 or 4, suddenly the rains came, and the Kinneret went way up. It went up by the space of about 2 meters. And I remember driving around it and feeling this visceral thrill, how wonderful it is to see the water being replenished, how amazing it is. I don't understand it. Look, my mother also gives to the Weizmann Institute. I probably shouldn't be saying this in front of Russell, but it's a great institute. That's what I felt passionate about, and it's what I connect to. And I think, I would be the last person to denigrate any of the other extraordinary things that are happening in Israel. I just happen to feel emotionally connected to this in a way that goes beyond words.
Thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry. I should be fair. I'll get to you, but you're at the mic first. So.
I think this gentleman.
Oh, he's there. Okay.
I'll let the young man go first.
You're the young man.
If you only knew how old I was.
If you only knew how old I was.
In light of what college students are experiencing on campuses today, the ideology that's being rammed down their throats, that's pretty much antithetical to Israel and the narrative that BDS is a viable route to take. Could you comment on what our college students are experiencing now and what could be done in the future to blunt their efforts?
It's interesting that you should ask that, because I just mentored a young recent graduate who's doing some work on that, a woman called Chloe Valdry, who you probably be. She spent a year working for me. Is she here? Yeah. Yo, what's up?
She's
I guess my answer is she knows more about this and has thought more deeply about it than anyone I've ever met. And she has this very extensive report. But I'll let her answer that at some point. I would make two points. One of them is this: a lot of what goes by the name of Israel advocacy essentially is an argument that is trying to fight our opponents to a kind of standstill. No, we had a UN declaration before 1948 and 47, and if you don't understand the Balfour Declaration. Well, if you don't agree with that, you don't understand the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire. And any normal college student would be like, oh, dude, whatever. And so it's not an argument. It's about having an argument with the Palestinians. It's not about telling the narrative of the Jewish people and having young people fall in love with the idea of the state of Israel and the whole concept of identity and culture and peoplehood being matched with statehood and excellence. And that's there are some people you have to love before you like. Israelis generally are those kinds of people. But that's a powerful thing. How do you get young people to fall in love with Israel before, and then give them the reasons why they also like them? And so that's the point: is how do you get the emotional connection going before you make the intellectual connection? There's the second point I would make is this, which is that I think too many Jews have essentially spent so much time arguing with themselves over what is or is not anti-Semitic that we have debased the term anti-Semitism. Look, I mean, in the 1960s, we got rid of legal discrimination in this country, the Civil Rights Act, Voting Act, and so on. But it took another 25 years before expressions of racism became taboos in public culture. So that, yeah, I mean, you have a First Amendment right to be a racist, I guess, but Hollywood isn't going to hire you, people aren't going to publish your books, whatever. It's a taboo, and taboos are good things. They are the margin between civilization and barbarism. Well, the taboo against anti-Semitism has been moving in the opposite direction. I used to joke, like, the only certified anti-Semite in the world is Mel Gibson, because he actually, in drunken moments, says, yeah, I hate Jews, they cause all wars, right? As opposed to everyone else who's like, I'm not an anti-Semite, how dare you, I'm merely an anti-Zionist who thinks that Israel is an illegitimate state committing genocide against the Palestinian people and has no right to exist, and all those Jews should go back to, the gas chambers in Poland, but don't call me an anti-Semite. And we say, well, that's an interesting point. We're going to think about this, and then we're going to have, just the other day, or maybe this is a couple months ago, but the former Israeli foreign minister, Tzipi Livni, came to speak at Harvard Law School. And one of the students, an Arab student there, stood up and he said, why are you so smelly? I don't understand. Why are you so smelly? To Tzipi Livni. And of course, the reaction of Harvard law students wasn't, this is outrageous, this is anti-Semitic, we're going to throw this guy, out the room. They're like, well, he didn't really mean what he said, and he's deeply contrite, and he just so the effort there, and by the way, by a number of Jewish students too, if you followed this, was to try to excuse this. Now, if Deval Patrick, Governor Patrick, had been making that comment, and some kid stood up and said, "Why are you so smelly?" Like, I don't think the result would have been the same. And that shows that somehow there's been a debasement, I think, in Jewish self-esteem to stand up and say, What you're doing is anti-Semitic, and until you absolutely prove to me that it's not anti-Semitic, I'm going to call you out as an anti-Semite, and I'm going to shame you. Anyway, I'll get to the next guy. Thank you.
In relation to the Iranian deal, can you comment on what went wrong with the North Korean deal back in the 90s with Richardson, President Carter, and President Clinton at the time?
Well, the North Korean deal is the same deal.
That's what I'm saying.
Right. You answered your own question.
Well, that's typical for a doctor.
If you want to entertain yourselves, do a Google search. Clinton Yongbyon Agreed Framework, that was the name of the deal, 1994. And Clinton makes exactly the same point about that agreed framework, how it was going to be able to ensure that we would verify that North Korea would never get a nuclear weapon, right? Makes the same argument that 21 years later, the Obama administration, Secretary Kerry, President Obama, are making about the Iran deal. So, when Samuel Johnson remarried his first wife and then thought maybe that wasn't such a good idea, he coined the phrase, the triumph of hope over experience. That's where it comes from. There you go. When you make the same deal again, same result. Sir.
Yes, I would like clarification. First of all, I really appreciated everything you've said today. I was very pleased with that. But there was one point I wasn't clear on, and that was when you said the son of a candidate. And I'd like you to be more specific on that.
Oh, no. You misunderstood. I thought I said the son of an advisor to the candidate.
Oh,
I'll leave it to other people to enlighten you as to who this.
okay.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. My pleasure. I feel I owe this lady. Oh, that's okay. Sir.
Bret, first of all, I have to tell you, having come to these conferences for a long time, that was probably the greatest speech I've heard.
Okay, and I'll ask him.
And you are a great writer and read you all the time. So, as a corollary to your point, just I wanted a question on the business about Tippy going to Harvard and so forth. So, you pointed out that that the policy of rewarding or aligning yourself with countries that don't share our values in terms of freedom of speech, freedom of religion, supporting things like women's rights, gay rights, and so forth. My question to you is, why do you think that there is what I call a synaptic disconnect? Why is there a disconnect in people's minds between those who support civil liberties and civil rights in our country and yet support regimes against Israel who believe the absolute antithesis of what they believe in this country?
That's a very profound question about which that's a question about political, not just political psychology, but political philosophy. And I've thought deeply about it, but it would take a long time to answer the question.
I'm not going anywhere.
Well, okay, very briefly. Very briefly, there's a wonderful history. A woman historian at Williams College wrote it about 20 years ago. I read it a long time ago, so I'm blanking on her name. But it contrasted the French Revolution with the American Revolution, and it was called American Light, French Lightning. And it was really about two concepts of liberation. There's one concept of liberation which says liberation is about achieving liberty. That is to say, about creating institutions in which people can be free in some consistent, structured way. And the American Revolution was that kind of revolution. It was about creating a republic where there was at least, over time, the prospect that all people could enjoy the rights set out in the Bill of Rights. French Revolution is, as she called it, it's about lightning. And it's not just about liberty, it's about liberation. And there's a crucial difference between the idea of liberty and liberation. Liberty means ordered, structured liberty within a framework of rule of law. That's the state of Israel, that's the United States. Liberation means just overthrowing whatever came before. And there's a tendency on the progressive left, far left, to advocate that kind of, quote, freedom as opposed to liberal democratic freedom. So it's more about épater la bourgeoisie. It's about the overthrow of any kind of established order, even if the ultimate result of liberation is despotism. And so that captures some of the thinking of the far left, which is now so much a part of the BDS movement. And one of the things that I often do when I speak on college campuses, and I'll be talking at Vassar next week, should be fun, what I often say to these kids is, how many of you favor gay rights? They all raise their hands. What about women's rights? All hands go up. Concern for the environment? All hands go up. You think a prime minister commits a crime, he should go to jail? All hands go up. Think journalists should be able to speak truth to power? All hands go up. And then you kind of go down the list and you say, right, if those are your values, then the only country in the Middle East that supports your values is Israel. So if you want to tell me you're a member of the Muslim Brotherhood and hate Israel, I get it, okay? That's a perfectly legitimate point of view. It's intellectually a consistent point of view. I'm a Muslim brother, I hate the Jews, therefore I hate their state. I get it. But if you're going to tell me you're a liberal and a progressive, and by the way, the one state in the Middle East, in fact, the one state in the entire world to which you object, is the one state that has consistently upheld and exemplified your values in what amounts to a nonstop state of emergency in its 68 years of history, then you're either a fool or a hypocrite, and probably both. I'm told this is my last question. It goes to the lady on my left.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for speaking so eloquently about a difficult subject. But my question is more regarding, as an American that moved to Israel, as a millennial also working in Israel and thinking of its future all the time, you had mentioned that terrorists and terrorist organizations don't come out of poverty and right? And a lot of us in Israel, tend to believe that if we just, give economic incentive for Gaza and the West Bank people, then maybe something can grow from there. Now, when you had mentioned that, as now American living in Israel, wanting to, and a Zionist, a very strong Zionist, wanting to make a difference, what advice can you give us in terms of the conflict with our neighbors and the new generation in Gaza and the West Bank that doesn't have any changing view on Israel, but is formulating an identity that a lot of times is closely related to the identity growing within Israel as well, ideas of nationalism, etc. So as the JNF is a voice in Israel, what advice can you give us young people in terms of this conflict and how we might address that within Israel and our borders?
Well, it's another huge question. I mean, one point I would make is notice that when people say poverty is the cause, they say, well, no, ignorance is the cause. And they'll say, well, poverty goes with ignorance. And I say, I'm sorry, I know a lot of poor people who are not ignorant and are not bigots. And to conflate the two is shameful, considering. And so, the most important thing that can happen for the Palestinians is not, I'm all for economic empowerment, don't get me wrong, and whatever, but it's pedagogy. These are people who are given TV shows at age 4, Palestinian Sesame Street, depicting Jews as subhuman. So there's a media that feeds them a constant diet of Jews of Jews being a kind of agents of having a kind of satanic agency. That's wrong. The essence of the problem that you now have in the Palestinian society is an educational problem, fundamentally. So that would be, for me, the starting point of any kind of discussion. Now, part of the, I wanted to end on an optimistic note, but I'm Jewish, so clearly that's not going to happen. You know, in some way, Herzl's dream is unrealizable. That is to say, the idea that statehood would provide some kind of solution to the Jewish problem turned out to be false. It turned out to be a reformulation of the Jewish problem, albeit with the margin of the IDF to keep that reformulation at a safe distance from extinction. But the problem persists, and the problem persists because ultimately, much as we would like it to be in our hands to change the views of others, to abate the endless wellspring of anti-Semitic hatred, it's not. It's just not. I mean, I can argue till I'm blue in the face that anti-Semitism causes the Arabs actually many more problems than it causes us. And in fact, it's true because people who are bigots end up also suffering from their bigotry. But it's not ultimately in our hands to resolve their bigotries or to prove them wrong or to show by conspicuous acts of magnanimity and ingenuity and wonderfulness that we're really not so bad. Because if you're already inclined to think that we're satanic as Jews, you know, no amount of like, but I'll cure your polio or whatever is gonna change their mind. You're curing my polio in order to give me Alzheimer's, you know, or whatever. and that's a deep point. And look, someone asked me, my first question is, why do I like JNF? I like it because it's ultimately about self-improvement. I think that's the only thing we can, as Jews, we can give ourselves. It's frankly the only thing as human beings that we can give ourselves. That we're going to be hated now, in a decade, in 100 years, we should probably take as some kind of given. Anti-Semitism is one of the great eternals and the great mysteries of human history. The question isn't whether we're going to be able to persuade every anti-Semite that we're really not so bad. The question is, are we going to make our minds and our land and our community and civilization flourish or not? That's the question. So that's what we're here for. Thank you very much.